Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about an actual book. Yes, I know it's been a while, hasn't it? Anyway, I want to talk about A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, which I finished last night, and I'm still very excited about it. And I'm gonna talk about it whether you want to or not. Cheers. All right, I'm going to do the usual thing, which is give you a quick synopsis and like why you really should go out and read this book as soon as possible. And then I'm going to look at some aspects that might be considered spoiler-ish, although I'll try to avoid like actual, plot spoilers. I do think it's very difficult to spoil a book like this, but I'll still do the usual thing here. So let's start. What is A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James? Well, it's definitely what you might call literary fiction or contemporary literary fiction or whatever. It's not sci-fi and it's not fantasy. It's possibly historical fiction if you want to look at it that way. And it won a Booker Prize a couple of years ago, so it's big brain literature. Don't worry, it's still fun. And yeah, like everyone has been reading Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and the Dark Star trilogy by Marlon James, and I was still very intrigued by that, but I didn't go and read it because it's not yet finished. And then I seemed to remember that Richard K. Morgan recommended Brief History of Seven Killings a while ago. By a while, I mean like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. So I just went and spent one of my one of my leftover Audible credits on that thing and just got reading on it, and I loved it a lot. So yeah, what is it? Why should you read it? And what's the caveats here? As I said, it's a historical novel. It covers roughly 15, 16 years of history, of Jamaican history, from 1976 all the way up to 1991. It begins with the assassination attempt on Bob Marley, and looks at like a lot of stuff that led up to that event, possibly true, possibly not true, and a lot of stuff that came afterwards, maybe as a result of that, or maybe not, and how that one key event in Jamaican history affects a lot of people that were touched by it. So that's the setup. It's only 5 chapters. Those are very, very long. You can call them parts, if you will. Each of those is more or less one day, although it does have flashbacks and stuff around it, but it usually takes place in one day. And each of those chapters is told first person through the eyes of a bunch of characters. Some of them come, in all of those chapters, some of them not. And how they, interact and how they view those events or take part in those events that are described. And it follows, Jamaican history from the political rivalries between the JLP and the PNP, both like the Jamaican Labour Party and the People's National Party, which are, sort of drawn into what you might call the Cold War, and how that shakes out into drug trafficking in the 80s and all the stuff all the way up to the 90s. So that's basically the rough outline here. It is, and I have to say this, it is a very graphic book. There's a lot of graphic violence in here, so be aware of that. I mean, it deals with, it deals with crime, it deals with poverty in Jamaican ghettos, it deals with casual violence a lot, and you get all of that stuff very unfiltered in your face, so to speak. And if that kind of stuff disturbs you, then maybe this is not the book for you. But if you don't mind, and people watching my channel reading, a lot of adult fantasy should not mind violence just because this time it's real and not, perpetrated against elves, it's still violence. So there's that. And there's another drawback I have to mention, but large parts of these stories, of the story, are written in Jamaican patois, which, can be difficult to understand for someone who doesn't, speak that language, which for whom maybe English isn't even their first language. Not that Jamaican patois is that close to your standard British English anyway, but it does have that, and it gives obviously, and there's a the that's like the downside is that it's kind of hard to understand, but you'll get into it after a while. You'll get into it. It took me like, I don't know, one section, so to speak, by the first section in patois, I was like, oh, I gotta slow down this audiobook, otherwise I'll be completely lost. But then I got it, and it actually adds, and this is the upside, it adds to the atmosphere of this book, and we'll talk about that later, I guess, a bit more. So that's sort of the rough details. What you get is basically one of those mob story, crime story, history, historical novels, large panorama of Jamaican history, something that you probably, if most people haven't spent too much time looking into, I guess, unless you're either from there and thus already touched by it, or you have already focused on Caribbean history, which, good on you for that. If not, this is probably very new for you, and we can always learn, which I think is one of the strengths of this book. Plus, and this is the other part, through the style of narrative, the lot of like different characters, first person viewpoints, sometimes they're more like stream of consciousness writing than anything else. It really drags you in and makes this very, very personal very quickly. And that's the big strength of this. It's like, you go out of this book, I promise you'll go out of this book and you'll deeply care about Jamaican history, and you'll deeply care about even something like reggae, which I never liked. You'll start caring about these things. It makes things very personal, and that's the huge strength of this book. So if you're into any of these things that I just mentioned, do yourself a favor, go and read it. Yes, it's not the easiest read of all times. Yes, it is very violent, but there's a point to it, and I think it's probably, and I'll say this right now, it is the best book I've read this year. And that includes a version by Alistair Reynolds, which is still my favorite 2022 release so far, but this one just blew me away in a lot of ways. So yeah, go and read it, and then let's have a discussion about it in the comments. And I'll just have a quick drink while you go and read it. It's not that long. Well, it's 700 pages, but still. And then we talk about some aspects that I think make this book interesting and are worth discussing. You done? Sweet. All right. So, what's there to discuss about this book? I want to look at a couple of aspects here, as usual. And I think the first one is, once again, the first-person narrative. Yes, it draws you in, and I think it does something here that a lot of fantasy sometimes can't do, or sometimes avoids doing. Yes, this is extremely violent. The level of graphic violence, the level of graphic descriptions of poverty, the way, and this I think is another part that Marlon James does extremely well, and a lot of fantasy authors kind of forget. Not all of them, don't get me wrong. And it's something that AP has recently mentioned in one of his like how to write good or tricks that writers do videos. James does use all the senses. Like when he describes the garbage lands behind Copenhagen City, that part of the ghetto, you can feel, and you can feel the stench, you can smell the stench, you can feel the physical power of like the heat coming off the pavement, the physical force of these mountains of garbage. You can feel the dripping of the garbage. It is intense, is what I would say. It is absolutely intense, and it makes you feel those elements, and those are obviously, parts of poverty. It does that in a fantastic way that I have seen fantasy and sci-fi authors use, all the senses before. Don't get me wrong, there are obviously authors that do that, but on that level, with that like force behind it, I have rarely seen, whether not even only not in fantasy or sci-fi, but rarely seen in any book delivered with that level of just punch behind it. And I think that's something that is really important here. Another part that I think is important to look at is the use of patois. Now, as I said, it's kind of difficult for me to understand that, or it was at least at the beginning, and I assume it will be so for most people that have no background in the Caribbean. Um, but what it does is, and I think this is an important aspect again, it adds a very specific rhythm to the book. It adds a very specific rhythm to the whole story, to the narratives. It drives the language in a way that meshes perfectly with, the first person stream of consciousness style kind of narration that we have in these books. It does so in a way that, yeah, that those two things complement each other, the rhythm of the patois and the first person narrative, and it almost like whips you forward, it punches you forward through this story, which is, at least in large parts, a very, very, it's a driven story most of the time. It has drive to it in a way that is interesting, and the rhythm of the language in the way that Marlon James uses it does contribute a lot there. And I think that's another aspect that I think is important to understand and is important to pay attention to. Just, as an additional aspect beyond just, giving you the feeling of this being about adding like local atmosphere by using the language spoken by the people in that area. But it goes beyond that because, and this is, I think, where we talk about post-colonial, post-imperial, or anti-imperialist, and so forth concepts. Because whether you want to or not, whether Marlon James deliberately set out to write a post-colonial book or not, I think it's very difficult to write a book about places like the Caribbean without them being post-colonial in a way. And James does, and I think the strength is having all these different viewpoints on the situation of Jamaica. It does a lot of things, because if there's one thing that we've learned, or that I have learned so far about post-colonial ideas, is they're not unified. There's 100,000 perspectives on that, because having a post-colonial state is exactly that. You have people that have all kinds of different experiences with being colonized, with being under the fist of an empire, having survived that. We have all of these different perspectives, and each of the characters in this book does look at, like, what does it mean to be Jamaican? What is this place, Jamaica? What could it be? What is it? And so forth. It does do that justice by having all these different perspectives. And all of them, and this is something that I found very interesting. It's like how even their use of language shifts from perspective from narrator to narrator. Some of them have a much more brutal patois, more and some of them speak more or less standard English in a way, and James even weaves that experience and how, for example, the use of patois versus high school English or whatever is used as a tool of imperialism, which drives into that book Babel that I'll plan to read next. But here it's examined on a practical level. It's people from the poorer areas, from the ghetto, talk differently, and people from uptown talk differently. And if some of those people from uptown start using more patois, they either get shit from their parents for doing so, because they're suddenly no longer trying to keep that status that they already have, or they're not taken seriously as tryhards from uptown by the people that are worse off on that economic ladder. And the way this book, just on a practical level, shows through remarks, through that stream of consciousness, people reflecting on what they're doing, shows how language, how dialect, or the level of dialect you speak, is a tool of distinction. And in a highly, stratified society or post-colonial society like Jamaica, distinction is really turns quickly into actual discrimination in a lot of ways. And the way this book shows that just through the use of language is something that I found very, very fascinating. Something that, on a rational level, I was aware of that before. I'm aware of that. I mean, we have all these discussions on African American vernacular English and stuff like that out there, but there's a difference between having that driven home in a novel in the way this book does, and just being aware of it on like a conscious, like on a rational level. I think that's a huge difference, and that's one of the things that this book does so fantastically well. And there's more. Now, there's a lot of stuff about, Rastafari, culture, belief, all of that. The idea of hair, we're all having this discussion about hair, especially with African American people and so forth. I'm not a part of that conversation, but the whole like, are dreadlocks okay for non-black people kind of discussion is, tackled here in a very specific, very practical, very pragmatic first person way that I feel a lot of like, leftist YouTube people, white people rationally explaining to you why it's cultural appropriation and sucks if you do that. There's a difference to the way it is just handled on a pragmatic level here, and it shows because this is, discussions about like the 70s and sometimes early 80s, but mostly the 70s. It does, drive home that is not just a discussion that, well-off hipster, well-off millennials, late millennials and Gen Zs have come up now to annoy the old people. No, the problem was always there, and it shows that in an interesting way, in a very direct way, how, stuff like hairstyle, how stuff like clothing and so forth are an essential part to mark your way in that highly stratified, highly, pressurized society that Jamaica is at the time. And it does that in a fantastic way that I found, it does something here. And I guess I'll have to talk about that in a different video, but like there's an idea of, philosophical idea of what like literature can do that other types of books can't do, that fiction can do. And there's that exactly. It drives things home in a way, makes them personal in a way that a lot of, abstract texts or arguments can't do. And I think whether Marlon James set out to do that or not, he certainly achieves that effect, or achieved that effect with me, which I found fascinating. And I hope it made me think differently about such aspects, such elements in a lot of ways. Right, another aspect, a political aspect, because this is a political book. Now, not we all, but people that have, seen broader mainstream leftist narratives over the last, whatever, decades, are aware of the story of the CIA fucking up some country in the name of the Cold War and then sort of, dragging it into organized crime and so forth. That narrative has been around forever. The reason is, well, it actually happened. That's one part of it. But it's also like it's a very comfortable narrative in a lot of ways, right? It's a very comfortable narrative in that we have one very specific bad guy, that being the CIA and the USA during the Cold War, which fucked up all of Latin America and the Caribbean, all in the name of fighting communism, and it's comfortable narrative. And it's obviously in here as well. Thomas Pynchon has like made allusions to it in all his like 70s or like end of counterculture, end of hippie era novels. Like, I don't know, Crying of Blood 49 does touch on it, I think. Certainly Inherent Vice touches on it. Not others of his novels that deal with those kind of concepts. Other authors have dealt with it. All Kinds of Propaganda has dealt with it. But what James does is show in a way, that yes, this happens. He makes it personal. The effects very personal. How, that external influence, so to speak, manipulation, does tear apart and destroy all kinds of structures, local structures that are sort of built up. And whether you want to call it like, that is still imperialism that is happening there. Obviously, Jamaica is not an American colony in name, but the way it is treated by people from the mainland, US in this book, or other people actually, is very much still a colonial state. And it does that, but it also makes it very clear that this has like very personal impact on personal lives of all kinds of people. And it does show that in a very, for me at least, interesting and very personal way. But it also shows, and I think that's the other part that I personally really appreciated about it, by having all these people like Josie Wales as a character, or Papalo. It very much shows how people in these countries do have power up to a point, and do have the capability to abuse, or at least, play with or take advantage of those foreign agents that try to use their country as a piece in a game. Basically, it shows that in a fantastic way, by having all these people that constantly talk about all of these Jamaican characters constantly talking about like being underestimated, people not expecting Josie Wales to speak Spanish, people thinking that they need to explain everything in simple words because probably no one of these people has ever read a book, and so forth. That arrogance, that arrogance of white arrogance that comes with that like idea of colonialism, whether it is legal colonialism or just colonialism in gesture and all of that, in all practical purposes, there is that level, that power difference that is assumed by the colonial power, by the imperialist power from the outside, and that so much of that is just assumed and an illusion, is something that I found very interesting with this book, and something that I appreciated a lot about it, how it does actually do that. Like show how that can be used, or taken advantage of by the people on the ground if they dare so. All right. What else is important? Well, the personal level, of course. We have these individuals, and we see how all of these events do impact personal lives. And Nina Burgess is certainly I don't want to say the most interesting character, but certainly the character where we can see a lot of that, because we also have all these still sexist elements in there. But part of them are definitely misogynist, but the idea of being a woman in that situation is even harder than being a guy in that situation. And we have all of these personal aspects, the trauma, the PTSD, all of these elements in there that all come from this one key element, that is the attack on Bob Marley in 1976. So it shows the personal cost, the human cost for the individual, because what we tend to do, right, when we watch the news, we see 100 people killed in shooting. We're like, fuck, that's 100 people. But we don't know those people. They're just names and faces on the TV or the internet or whatever. But having these individual lives basically placed on the examination table and taken apart, dissected in front of us, and seeing every single individual aspect that is touched by an event. Marlon James does a wonderful job of that, and that's something that I really loved about this book. And I think very few books do actually manage to pull that one off on that level. And then there's one final thing that I really appreciated about it, and it kind of reminded me of some of the Thomas Pynchon novels that I've read. The idea that we have a chance to make a better life. And in this case, it's the peace concert in 76, or then in 78. The idea that there is a chance for a country as broken down and exploited by everyone and their dog as Jamaica, right? For everyone to actually dream and believe that there is a better future, that there is peace, that there's a chance for peace, there's a chance to make things right and get them right and make things better, and that sometimes these situations come, and it's important to hear about those situations. It's important to hear about those chances, whether we take them or not, because what they show us is that they will come back. There will be chances like that again, and we'd better not fuck it up the next time round. And that's something that you can, generalize away from just Jamaican history. It's something that you can take and look at all kinds of elements of our lives, of how we deal with the world, whether it's something in our own countries where we live, whether it's a global thing. Sometimes there's these key moments when all of, not all of history, but a lot of things come together. There is this spirit in the air. There is that moment of where history seems to be there and has this momentum, and unfortunately mostly it gets fucked up, which is sort of where we end up with, well, this book shows it in a way, Pynchon does show the same thing. It's like when the system strikes back, because the system, whatever the system will be, does profit from things staying fucked up, from things staying the way they are. The system, and the system is, it's super abstract, but you know what I mean, right? There is always people profiting from things being bad. And that's the people we have to fight when those situations come about. But we should never give up the hope that those situations can't ever come up and can't ever be true. It's about that element of hope that is there, and people need to hear about that element of hope. And I think that's a strong message near the end of this book. And I love that about it as well. So, what can I say in summary? It's a fantastic book. It has touched me in a way I was not expecting. I really loved it. It is heavy, it is dark, it is moving, it is emotional, and it has made me think about a lot of things that I have only thought about in like an abstract way, but it has made them very personal and driven them home. And I hope that you read it, or if you have read it, that you actually enjoyed the book, that it actually moved you in some way. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments about all of that. And well, if you enjoyed all of this, I don't know, like, subscribe, do the things, and please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinions. I'd love to argue with you. I'd love to talk to you, and thanks for watching. Cheers.